of 1992, delegates from all over the world met in Rio de Janeiro to continue the perpetuation of one of the greatest hoaxes in history. 99% of the people in the world are living in fantasy land. I've been lecturing for years that there is no depletion of the ozone, there is no ozone layer, and what have been called holes in the ozone layer are nothing more than natural occurrences that occur always in the same place every winter, depending upon which pole is experiencing winter at that particular time. These hoaxes are intended to help impose austerity during the present economic collapse by shutting down industry and infrastructure and by attacking and destroying science itself. Last year, folks, the National Geographic Society released in book form the results of a Gallup poll of 10,000 individuals internationally testing their knowledge of geography. The National Geographic Society considers it, quite correctly, a mark of illiteracy that 56% of American respondents do not know the population of the United States. 32% cannot name any of the members of NATO, and 50% cannot name any members of the Warsaw Pact. But not to worry. Most Americans, 84%, are aware of concerns that fluorocarbons and other chemicals may be destroying the Earth's ozone layer. Oh my God. Among those that are aware, almost all, 94%, realize that the impact of a depleted ozone layer would be felt all over the world. Nearly 3 in 4, or 73% of all respondents, knew that wind patterns, and not the ozone layer, ocean currents, or sunspots spread the fallout from the nuclear accidents at Chernobyl. As the Soviets have emphasized as part of their glasnost disinformation campaign, we in the free world must no longer see them through the lenses of an enemy image. Quote, "The new enemy is us. International economic security is inconceivable unless related not only to disarmament, but also to the elimination of the threat to the world's environment," unquote, said Mikhail Gorbachev to the United Nations General Assembly on December the 7th, 1988. Quote, "Time is running out. Much is being done in various countries. Here again, I would just like to underscore most emphatically the prospects opening up in the process of disarmament, particularly, of course, nuclear disarmament, for environmental revival," unquote. Scam 1, the holes in the ozone layer. The surface of this planet is covered by dry bits called land and big wet bits called water. Where these two bodies meet is termed a beach, which may be sandy, rocky, cliff face, or any one of many other types. And where these beaches occur, there is to a greater or lesser extent a certain amount of wave activity called surf. Remember Annette Funicello, Frankie Avalon, beach blanket, bingo, surf? Guess that tells you how old I am, doesn't it? Well, imagine that you are strolling along a beach somewhere, minding your own business, and enjoying the view, when out of nowhere comes a demented Donald Francis III, hysterical, screaming, who wants to enlist your help in freeing the beach of board riders because they are wearing down the surf. He goes on to earnestly explain that the thin line of surf is the only thing holding back the ocean, and if the board riders wear it out enough, the layer of surf will become so depleted that it can no longer hold back the ocean, and the ocean will flood over the land and destroy mankind. What would be your reaction to such a person? Well, I think you'd quite possibly conclude, and quite correctly, that Donald Francis III should be confined to the local funny farm as quickly as possible. Wouldn't you? I should say at this point that most of this information on this program comes from the Executive Intelligence Report dated October 27th, 1989. Now, I've been lecturing for years that there is no ozone depletion, that there is no ozone layer, and that there is no danger from being fried by ultraviolet light rays. The reason that more people are getting skin cancer from exposure to the sun is because more people are out in the sun. It's a matter of demographics, population. Well, this is exactly the kind of logic being used to support the hole in the ozone layer scam, and erstwhile intelligent people are running around with varying versions of this Chicken Little story that the sky is falling. The sky is falling! The sky is falling! The ozone is being depleted! Oh my God! We must seek help! Without ever making even the slightest attempt to find out what is really happening and why. And you know, you all learned about this stuff in junior high school. As with the greenhouse effect, it is only necessary to understand a few very simple scientific facts to totally understand and debunk this scam. First of all, what exactly is the ozone layer? Our ozone mantle, as it is now being called, which supposedly protects us from all that unwanted ultraviolet light. Well, quite simply and bluntly, there isn't one. Just as the surf is not a magical barrier to the ocean flooding the land, and is, in reality, simply an effect of where land and water meet, so too is the so-called ozone layer. It's merely an area where an effect can be detected, not a cause. So let's start with a very basic chemistry lesson, which again can be confirmed with any junior high school textbooks. First of all, now listen carefully. This is very basic. I know a lot of you didn't take chemistry, but this is really easy to understand, so just relax, open your ears, close your eyes, sit back and listen. First of all, existing on this planet Earth and probably elsewhere is an element called oxygen. According to my dictionary, oxygen is an element with the chemical symbol O. Now, oxygen, for reasons I won't go into here, but which you can readily find out for yourself from the aforementioned junior high school chemistry book, rarely, if ever, exists as the single atom O. Such a single atom of oxygen, or most other elements, is called an ion. And it is very difficult for most substances to exist freely in their ionic state. So what normally happens is that two of these atoms of O seek each other out, combine, or stick together and form the molecule O2. That means a molecule formed by two atoms of oxygen. And this is the oxygen as you and I know it. This is the stuff you and I and all other living creatures breathe in and expel. And what we expel after we've breathed it in and used it is carbon dioxide, or CO2, which is one carbon atom and two oxygen atoms. In other words, it's oxidized carbon. In yet another of nature's wonderful balancing acts, green plants breathe in the CO2, extract the atom of carbon, C, as a building block in their cellular growth and expel oxygen, or O2. Now this is why it's so important that we stop destroying all the green stuff on the land by overclearing and stop polluting up the oceans and thereby killing all the little green plants known as plankton. Because most of the oxygen that we breathe comes from these trees and this plankton. O2, or two oxygen atoms stuck together, if you like, is the normal or most prevalent form of oxygen in the atmosphere. But it's not the only one. If one applies various forms of energy to the O2 molecule, it will break down to its ionic state and reform into another configuration, one where 3, not 2 atoms of oxygen stick together to form a new molecule. And this new molecule is called O3, or ozone. Remember, O3, ozone. Now, the energy required to perform this little trick can come from quite a few different sources. An electrical discharge through the air will do it, and it's probably one of the most common forms that you will recognize. Unlike oxygen O2, which is odorless, ozone has a distinct pungent smell. That's what you smell after a thunderstorm. Remember, you walk out after lightning strikes somewhere, or there's been a lot of lightning in the atmosphere, and you can smell that peculiar smell that smells kind of nice, actually. That's ozone. Now, if you've never smelled that, go around your house somewhere and pick up your kid's electric train engine or radio-controlled car after it's been operating for a while, and you'll smell this odor. That's because the electrical discharge where the bushes run on the motor turns a certain amount of oxygen, O2, into ozone, O3. Electrical storms, or at least the subsequent bolts of lightning, ionize a great deal of the surrounding air and create a certain amount of ozone. But folks, listen to this now. It's going to make you feel a little bit silly when you find out what the biggest source of energy for the conversion of oxygen O2 into ozone O3 is. It's the sun, or the energy from the sun, in the form of ultraviolet light. Now, if you're really intelligent and you're really smart, you already know what I said, don't you? Check this out. They're saying that the ozone layer is being depleted. And it's being depleted. Ultraviolet light is coming through the atmosphere, striking our skin and causing us to die. You understand what I'm saying? But it can't be happening, folks, because the biggest source of ozone in the atmosphere is from ultraviolet light. Ozone doesn't protect us from ultraviolet light. Ozone is formed from ultraviolet light. Do you understand what I'm saying? Ultraviolet light cannot come through the atmosphere without striking molecules of oxygen, and when it does, it forms ozone, and the ultraviolet light is depleted by this chemical reaction. You understand? Ozone is not protecting us from ultraviolet light. No, oxygen protects us from ultraviolet light by depleting the ultraviolet light when the ultraviolet light strikes the molecule of oxygen and turns it into ozone. What happens is a cycle something like this. You and I breathe in oxygen, called O2, and breathe out CO2, carbon dioxide. Plants, on the other hand, breathe in carbon dioxide and expel oxygen. The cycle is more or less endless. And as long as there's oxygen in the atmosphere, we're okay. And you know what? I measured the percentage of oxygen in the atmosphere. It's exactly the same as there was 80 years ago. 80 years ago. How about that? I also measured CO2. It's the same also. Now, if you measure these near cities, then you get radical readings. But if you go way out in the country and measure the atmosphere, there's no difference than 80 years ago. And if you don't believe me, you can do it yourself. You can buy oxygen and CO2 analyzers from Beckman Instruments, and you can go out and measure it yourself. CO2 analyzers, oxygen analyzers. How do I know this? How do you think we measured the mixture of gases that we were making up for divers to dive with so that they would have the right mixture and it wouldn't kill them? You see, folks, you've really been fooled. Here's how it works. We have oxygen throughout the atmosphere. From the other direction, light from the sun streams in. A certain amount of this light is absorbed or deflected by various elements. atoms, molecules, and particles of other matter, dust in the air, whatever. The bulk of this light from the sun, however, continues its downward journey toward the planet's surface until it encounters the oxygen molecules. At the point where the sunlight reaches a sufficient concentration of oxygen molecules, a reaction takes place. A certain portion of the light from the sun, that portion known as the ultraviolet section, strikes the O2 molecules and imparts its energy to the oxygen molecule it has struck. This has two effects. First, it greatly reduces the amount of ultraviolet light which would otherwise reach the Earth's surface, because the ray, or unit, or beam of light, loses energy and becomes light in the lower spectrums, the ones we call colors. This is one of the causes of that spectacular light show called the Southern or Northern Lights, Aurora Borealis. Second, it converts the oxygen molecules, O2, into ozone molecules. Wake up. There's a portion of our atmosphere from 10 to 50 kilometers up which does not, however, get this name because it contains some magical, mysterious layer of matter known as ozone, which exists and has existed from the beginning of time to protect us from ultraviolet light, and which is now under dire threat from various man-made products. No. That is a crock of crap. It's a hoax. It's a lie. I like lie better because that's what it really is. It's a lie. It's called this name because this is the region where oxygen molecules are struck by incoming ultraviolet light and convert to O3, or ozone molecules, and it therefore has a slightly higher proportion of ozone molecules to oxygen molecules. Why only a slightly higher portion? Because remember, the atmosphere is constantly mixing. It doesn't stay there very long. And remember that ozone is a free radical. As soon as it strikes something that will oxidize, it reverts back to a molecule of oxygen, and the free radical forms with whatever was oxidized. Do you understand? There will continue to be an ozonosphere, and that's what it should be called. It's not an ozone layer, it's an ozonosphere, or as it is incorrectly termed, as ozone layer. There will always be this meeting of ultraviolet light and oxygen in the atmosphere, for as long as the planet's surface continues to manufacture oxygen to rise, and for as long as the sun continues to emit light to encounter that oxygen. You understand, we're in no danger from burning up from ultraviolet rays as long as oxygen exists in the atmosphere. It's not ozone that stops the ultraviolet light and protects us from this harmful light ray, this harmful energy from the sun. Ozone is a creation of the oxygen's protection of the earth from this harmful sun's energy. Oxygen is what does it, and oxygen is converted to ozone, which then lives only for a very short period of time because it's a free radical. How about that? That gets you a little angry? Don't shoot the messenger. Don't shoot the messenger. I'm just straightening you out here. You need to be straightened out. You see, this is no different than the meeting of the water and the land. And just as there will always be surf for as long as there are places where water meets land, there will always be ozone in places where ultraviolet light meets oxygen. The misnamed ozone layer will continue to simply be the end result of where two opposing forces and systems meet until such time as one or the other of those forces or systems just plain ceases to exist. Just as there will always be surf for as long as there is land and water, there will be an ozonosphere as long as there is oxygen and sunlight. Isn't that interesting? If either one of these packs up, we will have long since suffocated or frozen to death or something else, long before we develop skin cancer. As I said, this is stuff you can check out for yourself with the simplest of reference books. And if you hold up the statistics that say there's more people getting skin cancer now than there was 25 years ago, that's because there's more people on the beaches and out in the sun than there was 25 years ago. And if you don't believe me, check the statistics. It's true. And per capita, there's no more instances of skin cancer caused by the sun than there was per capita 25 years ago, or even 40 years ago. Except that the farther back you go, the more common it was to protect yourself from the sun and stay out of the sun. Sun tanning is a relatively modern phenomenon. It was not considered cool not too long ago. Let's look at some facts about the ozonosphere, as we'll call it. And you might say, okay, Bill, what about the so-called holes in the ozone layer? Well, as we have seen, there's no such thing as a magical, mysterious ozone layer, so there can't be any holes in it. However, there is a region called the ozonosphere, which normally has a higher incidence of O3, ozone, than O2, simply and purely because it is a region where a segment of sunlight or ultraviolet light strikes oxygen molecules and converts them into ozone molecules. Now, given the chemical, physical explanation of the ozonosphere as opposed to the hysterical version currently being peddled by the media and those who want to subvert the sovereignty of nations and give up control to take care of this imagined problem. It's not imagined, it's a purposeful lie. It becomes immensely easy to predict that there will be two holes in this said ozonosphere, are not holes. They're just places where this reaction does not take effect at certain times of the year. Now understand that the Earth is always tilted on this axis in relation to the sun. That's what causes us to have summers and winters. So you have to understand that at certain times of the year, as either the South Pole or the North Pole are closer or farther away from the sun, there is an area of the atmosphere directly above either the Arctic or the Antarctic where there is no meeting of oxygen and ultraviolet light. And you notice that these are the only places where they ever take photographs that show that there's no ozone in the atmosphere at that point. Actually, even though they show that there's none, there's always some. If lightning goes through the atmosphere, there's ozone. However, there's not as much as there would be if the sun, the ultraviolet light, were striking oxygen molecules at that point. Does everybody understand that? Gee, I sure hope you do, because I'd hate to start all over and explain this again. I hope you're taping this episode of The Hour of the Time, the only hour that ever was or ever will be or that ever is, the hour during which you will decide your future and thus our collective futures. As I have demonstrated, the so-called ozone layer requires for its very existence that oxygen molecules interact with incoming sunlight or ultraviolet light in order to create ozone molecules which can then be measured and referred to as the magical ozone mantle that protects us from ultraviolet light. Now, as you've already learned, that's a crock of crap, a lie, a blatant, purposeful lie. It's not accidental. It is a real, purposeful lie. Now, there are two places, and only two on the face of the planet, where for a portion of the year no ultraviolet light strikes oxygen molecules, and therefore where there can be no large formation of ozone molecules. Now, folks, I'm referring, of course, to the northern Arctic Circle in the northern hemisphere, winter, and to the southern Antarctic Circle as the southern hemisphere, winter. The Earth, thank God, is not positioned exactly perpendicular to the rays of the sun. If it was, the sun would be overhead in the same place all the time, and the so-called tropical regions would just get hotter and hotter until they became uninhabitable deserts, and the polar regions would just keep freezing. The bulk of the Earth's surface would either be too hot or too cold to live in, with only a thin region where the two extremities met, capable of supporting life as we know it. Fortunately, this is not the case. The Earth is, in fact, tilted over to one side with respect to the sun, and it is this tilt that gives us our seasons. Now, if you could see a picture of the Earth, you would be looking at a representation of the Earth at what is known as the northern hemisphere as the summer solstice. That is, when the sun is directly overhead at the Tropic of Cancer. This is the height of the northern hemisphere summer. As you could clearly see if you had a diagram, no sunlight would be contacting the atmosphere above the Arctic Circle, and therefore there simply could not be any conversion of oxygen into ozone. Hence, there would be a measurable absence in the amount of ozone in the ozonosphere or in the atmosphere at that time. Well, it's break time, folks. Don't go away. We'll be right back after this short pause. Welcome back, folks. Want to have some fun? Make copies of this tape and send it to your local environmental extremists. Now, environmentalism is good, but extremism and outright deception is bad. Make copies of this tape, send it to all of them, and watch them go down in flames. As the sun's overhead position gradually changes and the sun moves back across the equator, the amount of sunlight reaching the Antarctic Circle gradually increases, thus giving rise to an increase in the incidence of ultraviolet light striking the atmosphere, thus causing this absence to again be filled with ozone. And the so-called hole to shrink. And the same thing would happen at the opposite pole when it went through its winter cycle. And surprise, surprise, there would be a measurable hole there in the amount of ozone in the ozonosphere. After the southern hemisphere solstice, the sun begins its journey northward again, and as we have in Australia slip into our autumn, the hole at the Antarctic Circle starts to grow again. But it's not really a hole. It's just an absence of ozone where the ultraviolet light is not striking oxygen in the atmosphere. And it's not coming down to the Earth and burning any humans to a crisp either. You see, it's not happening. Just not happening. This is a natural cycle, ladies and gentlemen, which has existed and will continue to exist for as long as the Earth is tilted. The atmosphere contains oxygen molecules, and ultraviolet light continues to come from the sun to convert them to ozone molecules. There are no laws that puny men can pass to stop this awesome forces and these cycles of nature, as King Canute learned when he attempted to order the tides to turn back. Laws to attempt to prevent the natural cycle of absence of ozone in the ozonosphere or in the atmosphere fall into the same category and should be treated with equal contempt. There's nothing you can do to change it. Do you hear me down in Rio de Janeiro? I know this broadcast gets there because this broadcast goes worldwide. Wake up. So where did all this nonsense about holes in the ozone layer come from anyway? Well, folks, back in 1985, the British climatological team in Antarctica discovered that at that particular time in the winter, there wasn't much ozone in the atmosphere at that point. And there was a relatively short bout of hysteria, as always, whipped up by complaint media because the whole thing was in somebody's interest. And that team was down there on purpose. They knew about this. They didn't have to go down there and figure it out. They already knew about it. This was purposefully done to create this hoax so that people would call for control. The only answer is one world government if you fall for the scam. And this was whipped up to bring that about. It was all front-page hype and speculation about how half the world's population would be dead from skin cancer by the year 2000. And similar preposterous stuff. Now, if you think back to late 1985, early 1986, you should be able to remember it all. You should also be able to remember that it had all just died away by late 1986, early 1987, and you heard nothing more about holes in the ozone layer until quite recently. You know why? Well, I'll tell you. You knew I would, didn't you? It all died away because by that time the British scientists at the South Pole had been studying the phenomenon long enough to realize that it was not some hideous, dire threat to mankind's future, but part of a natural, endless, repetitive cycle. They always knew this. And this was actually reported in the papers by the scientists. But naturally enough, not in screaming page 1 headlines, but buried up on page 53 or somewhere back there, between the comics and the obituaries. What was also reported at the time was that the scientists who now knew exactly what they were dealing with were packing up in Antarctica and moving camp to the northern polar regions to test their own predictions that there would be a similar hole there at the opposite time of the year, thereby proving that the holes were not a new threat to the environment and to mankind, but part of a natural cycle. And that, of course, is exactly what they did, and that is exactly what they found. Of course, such a reassurance would not suit those who wish us to live our lives in a constant state of near panic, and therefore ever more prepared to hand over control of our lives to some form of Big Brother to save us. Remember Big Brother? We talked about him already. To save us from these imaginary threats. And so, rather than the papers correctly reporting that the British team had discovered a second hole above the Arctic Circle, a hole they had already predicted, and had gone there specifically to confirm, thereby proving their theory that such phenomena were part of a natural cycle, the papers instead screamed out from their front pages, "Second hole in ozone layer discovered, dire double threat to mankind." BS. And of course, they printed other similar hysterical drivel. And now, Margaret Thatcher, the head of government in Britain, the person who was ultimately responsible for the team that discovered the first hole, and the person ultimately responsible for sending the team to the Arctic Circle to substantiate their theories, the person with access to all this information, and the person who should have been leading the way in debunking the scam, was the person inviting scientists and leaders from all over the world to formulate policies and agreements, and if necessary, world laws, to be administered by the United States to tackle this new threat. And there are still people trying to convince us that she's one of the good guys. She was never one of the good guys. None of them are. Remember I told you, at the highest levels, they all belong to the same club. Now, don't get me wrong. I'm not in favor of any strange laboratory-created substances polluting the air. I have to breathe too. And I wholeheartedly endorse the current campaign to rid the atmosphere of chlorofluorocarbons, CFCs, the atoms being blamed for the so-called holes in the ozone layer, but they are not responsible for it. But just stop for a minute and think. If CFCs cause the so-called holes, why are they only over the polar regions? Are the polar explorers and scientists using too much hairspray or deodorant or fly killer? Of course not. If there was going to be an ozone hole anywhere that was caused by CFCs, it'd be directly above Los Angeles, or Tokyo, or London. If they had anything to do with it, they'd be over New York or Tokyo. The holes would be over the major cities, not over the poles. Or at least somewhere relative to these places where it could be shown that the air currents were causing the CFCs to accumulate, but they are not. You see, the holes only occur in two places, predictable, and they occur every winter, wherever the winter happens to be, over the north and south polar regions, exactly in accordance with natural forces which create the bulk of ozone, and exactly in accordance with the theories and predictions of the scientists who discovered them in the first place. And why is it that this program, The Hour of the Time, is the only place that you could ever hear this? Because there really is no such thing as freedom of speech, ladies and gentlemen, but that's the subject for another program. Think about something else for a moment. Imagine a can of fly spray, if you like. Think about a whole supermarket shelf of cans of fly spray, or even an entire supermarket full of nothing else but cans of fly spray. Picture in your mind how much CFCs are involved, and will find their way into the atmosphere to somehow, never actually explained, destroy ozone. Now picture in your mind a Boeing 747 jet with its four massive engines. Now imagine that jet hurtling through the sky at hundreds of miles an hour, scooping literally tons of air into its engines every minute or so. Now, what those jet engines are doing with that air is extracting the available oxygen, tons and tons of it, and using it to burn kerosene, thereby using up the oxygen and creating various carbonic gases. And where do these jets fly? Why, predominantly up where this meeting between ozone and ultraviolet light takes place, the place we called the ozonosphere. That's right, the oxygen these jets destroy by the ton every minute or so is not the O2 variety you and I breathe, it's the O3 variety which supposedly exists as some kind of protective mantle, and which we must now save at all costs, even at the sacrifice of democracy and freedom. Every time a jet takes off and flies somewhere, it destroys more ozone than you and I could even imagine, let alone use as CFCs in a lifetime. We're not talking amounts that can even be conceived in terms of fly spray cans or deodorant or hairspray. We're talking volumes of ozone similar to the amount of water in Sydney Harbor at any given time, and that's one Boeing 707 or 747 or any one that you want. Pick one. Thousands, if not tens of thousands of such flights occur all over the world each and every day, except in Australia at Christmas, when, as everybody knows, all the airline staff go on strike every year, right on schedule. But have you heard anybody suggest that jet flight be banned, or at least kept below the ozonosphere? No, of course not. Any more than you hear people calling for the banning of automobiles because they kill 50,000 people every year. You're supposed to believe that all this massive consumption, millions of tons of ozone every day, is perfectly safe and poses no threat. But the next time you reach for the can of hairspray, you could just about bring down the end of civilization as we know it. Now, folks, if you accept this, then you probably really do believe that the surf protects us from the ocean, and we should stop the board riders from wearing it away. Now I ask you, just who is kidding who? And why are you falling for it? When are you going to wake up? When are you going to stop believing everything you hear? Remember my admonition? In this day and age, when there are so many deceptions running rampant to destroy the sovereignty of nations and bring about the one world government, you should never believe anyone or anything that you read. You must learn to do productive research and seek the truth. Seek ye the truth, and the truth shall set you free, and nothing else can do it. You are not to believe me. You are not to believe George Bush. You are not to believe Dan Rather. You are not to believe Ted Koppel. You are not to believe your school teacher. You are not to believe your mother. Unless you can substantiate it through your own research by finding hard proof. I hope you're capable of doing that, because if you're not, you are in big, big trouble, bigger than you can even imagine, much bigger than you can even imagine. Were you aware that they tried this once before, in 1972? Guess what, folks? They had the same meeting in 1972. Just a little different name, but it was all about the same thing. Save the earth, save the planet. In 1972. And guess what the major topic of discussion at that meeting was, folks? Guess what? The major topic was not global warming. It was not the depletion of the ozone layer. It was not about holes in the ozone layer. Nope. It was about global cooling. Global cooling. See, they've tried it before. But the truth is that global cooling is probably closer to the truth than anything else. Because going back through the history of the world, through the geology, you can find that ice ages have occurred on a regular schedule throughout the history of the world. There are regular cycles in nature. And that the warm periods are relatively short compared to the cold periods. And according to the geological scale of time, we are at the end of a warm period, and it should be absolutely natural for cooling to begin to occur. And according to the Agricultural Department of the United States government, this is exactly what has happened. In fact, they've had to replace their agricultural map that shows the regions where you can grow certain crops for the first time in their history. Because for the first time in the history of the Agricultural Department of the United States government, there are areas in the northern hemisphere where certain crops can no longer be grown because it is getting cooler instead of warmer. And the ice caps are not melting as you've been told. I checked with all the control stations throughout the world that measure mean tide levels. And folks, for the last 80 years, again, there's that 80 years. For the last 80 years, the mean tide level of all of those control stations has not changed, not even one fraction of an inch. A nation or world of people who will not use their intelligence are no better than animals who do not have intelligence. Such people are beasts of burden and stakes on the table by choice and consent. Is that the category that you really want to be in? You are listening to this broadcast, folks, because you can't help it. You've heard several editions of the Hour of the Time now, and you've learned that you cannot predict at all what you're going to hear on this show. You've already learned that you're going to hear things on this show that you will not ever hear anywhere else in any media, print, broadcast, television. I don't care. The reason is I don't owe anybody anything, period. I only have me to answer to, and I'm not a professional broadcaster, folks. No, this is something I'm doing because the opportunity arose to educate mass numbers of people around the world. And so I took it. If they cut me off and throw me off the air tomorrow, it won't mean a hill of beans to me. So holding the threat of losing this means nothing either. You see, the reason you don't hear information like you hear on the Hour of the Time on other radio broadcasts or on television or in the print is because those people have a vested interest in the furtherance of their career. They are professional journalists, professional television commentators, or professional radio hosts. Well, last Sunday, folks, you heard about the ozone hoax, and I'm just going to recap for just a few seconds because I'm going to continue with where last week left off so that you will be able to understand what's going on. You learned last week that there is no ozone layer, could better be called an ozonosphere, where the effect can be measured of where ultraviolet light rays meet molecules of oxygen, and that it is really oxygen that protects us from the ultraviolet light of the sun and not ozone. Ozone is a byproduct of the chemical reaction of the ultraviolet light from the sun striking oxygen molecules, splitting them into their ionic components, which then seek out other oxygen molecules and attach themselves, forming O3, which is ozone. It's very simple. It's in most junior high textbooks, or it was at least when I went to junior high school. May not be there now because they're destroying our educational system so that the people can never challenge the ruling elite. You also learned that the ozone holes really aren't holes, but are a place near the poles where this effect does not take place. The only place where the so-called ozone holes occur are near the poles in the Arctic and Antarctic circles. The holes only occur, folks, in winter, at whichever point is experiencing winter. They occur where the Earth's tilt causes perpetual night during the winter months, and where no ultraviolet light is coming into contact with oxygen. Therefore, no ozone is formed. So they're not ozone holes, they're just merely a place in the atmosphere near the poles where the effect does not take place. Therefore, no ozone is formed, except by the normal methods of lightning in the atmosphere and other discharges of energy. Thus, there is no production of ozone. Another so-called hole will predictably appear at the other pole region when that hemisphere is in its winter months. You should know by now that they are not holes at all, but only areas where the ozone-producing chemical reaction between ultraviolet light and oxygen does not occur. You should have also deduced from this process that the so-called holes will seem to appear and disappear as the region moves from winter into summer and then back again into winter. The whole process is a natural cycle. It is predictable and is very simple to understand. Didn't you think it was funny that the ozone holes were always over the poles and not over Los Angeles where everybody's using hairspray and all the CFCs are going up into the atmosphere? How stupid can you all be? It's incredible that you read something in a newspaper and just accept it as fact without questioning anything when you know damn well that there is no freedom of the press except for the owners, and the owners of the press will print what they want you to believe and not objective facts ever. Wake up, people. The scam that CFCs deplete the ozone layer, which is non-existent, can be easily exposed. You see, most of the CFCs in the world can be found in the northern hemisphere, where most of the rich nations are located. So why then does a so-called hole appear over Antarctica every southern hemisphere winter? Why not over New York, Tokyo, Paris, Los Angeles, or Stockholm, where the CFCs are in the most use and thus can be found in the atmosphere in the largest amounts? Why does Los Angeles spend hundreds of millions of dollars to deplete the ozone in the atmosphere directly above the city every year? And did you know that most major cities in the world spend hundreds of millions of dollars to deplete the ozone? In other words, destroy the ozone in the atmosphere above their cities? You weren't aware of that, did you? Well, if you don't believe me, call and find out. Call and find out. That's what I did. It's very simple. You see, because ozone is considered to be pollution. Oh, this is so hilarious. I'm telling you, folks. I can't help but laugh at all the sheeple out there that are just so stupid they'll believe anything that anybody tells them. It blows my mind. I can't comprehend how people can be so, the word is not ignorant, folks. The word is really stupid, mentally crippled, stupid. And this is just one example. You're going to hear a lot of examples on this show. And if you don't like that word stupid, you better change your dial right now, because you're going to hear it a lot. You got to wake up. And if you can't look at yourself and admit that you've been stupid, you're never going to wake up and you're never going to solve the problem. That's what I had to do. I had to look in the mirror, look right in my own eyes and say, Bill, you've been stupid for most of your life and you've got to change that now. You see, if I hadn't admitted to myself that I've been stupid most of my life, I would have never changed anything and I wouldn't be doing this tonight. So, why do we only find these so-called holes over the poles and not over New York, Tokyo, Paris, Los Angeles, or Stockholm? Is it because the few personnel stationed at the weather and research facilities at Antarctica use too much hairspray? Why is it that I am able to predict the exact locations and months that the so-called holes will appear and disappear over the Arctic and Antarctic? Because the whole thing is a hoax, folks, designed to make idiots who cannot think for themselves scream for total control of everything and thus help to usher in the one-world totalitarian socialist government. Let us take a real hard look at chlorofluorocarbons, or CFCs. For according to the doomsday prophets, chlorofluorocarbon molecules are going to rise to the stratosphere, where ultraviolet radiation will break them up, releasing chlorine molecules which will act like a hungry cookie monster and eat all the ozone molecules. This, of course, will cause an ozone hole and everyone will get skin cancer, right? Wrong. Totally wrong. Now, let's look at what they don't tell you. According to measurements, only 1% of CFCs actually break up in the stratosphere, so that 7,500 tons of chlorine, remember that number, 7,500 tons of chlorine, are being released into the stratosphere every year. That's for the whole atmosphere in a year's time. That's the total destructive force of chlorofluorocarbons, 7,500 tons of chlorine. The amount of chlorine spewed into the atmosphere from natural sources makes that measly 7,500 tons look like a drop in the ocean. The atmosphere, folks, absorbs 5 million tons of chlorine from ocean biota, algae, plankton, etc., 84 million tons from biomass burning, 36 million tons from volcanoes, and 600 million tons from seawater. This does not include a volcano like Mount Pinatubo, which loaded at least 20 million tons of chlorine into the atmosphere, of which a very significant portion went into the stratosphere. Mount Erebus in Antarctica, which erupts every day, emits 20 times more chlorine into the atmosphere than the entire amount of chlorine allegedly produced from the breakdown of CFCs. Mount Erebus is about 6 miles upwind from McMurdo Sound, the station from which chlorine measurements are taken. The readings are then used to claim that CFCs, not natural chlorine sources, cause the depletion of the ozone layer. It really does not matter, as ozone is not layered in the atmosphere, and it is not what shields us from those nasty, nasty little ultraviolet rays. No, it's the oxygen. The case is exactly the same with halogens. The doomsayers want all halogen fire extinguishers banned because they produce bromine. This chemical is supposed to be a super ozone destroyer, in fact 10 times more dangerous than CFCs. Well, then why don't the fire departments of cities like Los Angeles and other large cities who are trying to deplete the atmosphere use only halogen fire extinguishers to put out fires? The actual amount of bromine released is very insignificant, perhaps not even measurable, because most of the bromine that's actually in halogen is destroyed in a chemical reaction during fire suppression. That's why. On top of that, they never have a lifelong enough in the atmosphere that's necessary to even get up to the stratosphere. Ozone levels over a measured period of time shows a clear oscillation from year to year. If you compare the cycle in ozone levels with the number of sunspots over the same period, the correlation is clear. An 11-year and a 22-year cycle is in ozone levels matching the sunspot cycle are clearly evident. A major influence on the density of ozone in the atmosphere is sunspots, solar flares, in other words, the influence of the sun. It is how ozone is created in the first place. Billions of ions of ozone are created every instant and are destroyed every instant. In 1988, the Ozone Trends panel, the people that you've all been listening to like a bunch of idiots, without verifying anything, without demanding any scientific papers to back it up, without question. In 1988, this Ozone Trends panel released a report supposedly documenting that there had been a 3% depletion of the ozone layer over the northern hemisphere. They gave a press conference. They handed out a summary of the report. But the report itself did not come out for another 3 years. Did you hear that, folks? The report itself did not come out for another 3 years. And when it did came out, what it said was actually different from what they reported at the press conference. But it scared you all, scared everybody, and it got everything into motion that was necessary to ban CFCs without any scientific evidence, no scientific papers, no real scientific factual correlation. Without even issuing a report for 3 years, it got everybody going to ban CFCs. Then they gave a whole sequence of conferences after that with the same modus operandi. They gave a press conference in April 1991 that claimed 8% ozone depletion. No scientific paper to follow it up, no peer review of the data. And then last October they gave another press conference where they claimed something very similar, but again with no report, nothing published in the scientific literature. And the great herds of sheeple mobilized to save the ozone layer and ban CFCs. The wolf is at the door, folks, and since most of you are sheep, you're going to be eaten. That's what wolves do to sheep, especially foolish, stupid sheep. In the 1988 press conference, the Ozone Trends panel picked a very curious date, 1969, to start their analysis of worldwide ozone data. And they ended in 1985. 17 years are 1.5 solar cycles later. Remember what we said about the solar cycles, 11 and 22-year cycles? If you draw a straight line from 1969 to 1985, you get the ozone depletion that they claim. But if they had used the 22-year period between 1962 and 1985, there's hardly any change at all. It's entirely a decision of what date they picked to begin their measurements, one of the most critical features of how they've been manipulating public opinion. Well, while you think about those facts and figures, we're going to take a short break, folks. Don't go away. We'll be right back. Now, that didn't take too long, did it? Another way the Ozone Trends panel manipulated their data to scare the public involves the enormous variability in the ozone in the atmosphere from day to day, month to month, and at different times of the year. You didn't know that, did you? Changes from day to day. The density of the ozone in the atmosphere over the northern hemisphere in March, folks, is much greater than in October of the same year. A 40% difference, in fact, and it happens every year according to the natural cycles previously described. The panel started measuring in the time of year when the ozone is densest and stopped in the part of the year when it is the least dense. And they knew exactly what they were doing. Again, these groups are manipulating the data intentionally to scare the public into believing there is a danger which does not actually exist. Aren't you all scared? The sky is falling. That was Vice President-elect Al Gore with the #1 environmental hit, Scare You. Oh, yes. Yes. You're all supposed to be scared to death. Because there's holes in the ozone layer. The CFCs are gobbling the rest of them up like little Pac-Mans running through the sky. They also claim a drop-off in CFC concentrations going from 100 to 5 parts per trillion in just the first 2 or 3 kilometers upon entering the stratosphere. The ozone depletion proponents say the concentrations get lower because ultraviolet radiation is breaking up the CFC molecules, and the stratosphere is the only place where there are intense enough amounts of ultraviolet radiation to break down the CFC molecules. What a crock. The stratosphere starts around 25 kilometers above the Earth's surface, and very small amounts of ultraviolet radiation in the range necessary to break down CFC molecules get within 30 kilometers, folks. In order to find the significant concentrations of ultraviolet radiation that can break up CFC molecules, you've got to get above 40 kilometers. CFC molecules just don't make it up that high. They're heavy molecules. So it can't be ultraviolet radiation that's getting rid of the CFCs, which is then supposed to be releasing chlorine, which is then supposed to be destroying the imaginary ozone layer. Sorry, folks, it just ain't happening. It's not going on. You've been hoodwinked, the favorite Freemason term. You've been hoodwinked, hoaxed, lied to, scammed. But you know what? If you weren't stupid, it could never have happened. When I use that word stupid, I'm not talking to those of you who do use your head, who can think, who are searching for the truth, and who do verify before believing. Nope, I'm talking to the stupid idiot that's sitting next to you. Another thing they conveniently omit is that the stratosphere is an inversion layer, which means that instead of getting colder with altitude, it gets warmer. And when you have warm air on top of cold air, the cold air is like a plug. It's why Los Angeles has a smog problem. The air cannot rise above the valley because of the inversion layer. The air remains trapped. Whatever air makes it to the upper part of the atmosphere comes right back down because of this plug. There is no evidence that they are being broken up. The big threat touted by the doomsayers is increased skin cancer, a blatant, and I mean blatant, lie. The only reason skin cancer has risen is that the old taboos against being in the sun and sun tanning have fallen by the wayside. It wasn't too long ago when it was not cool to be out in the sun. It was not cool to have a suntan. And women were taught never, under any circumstances, let the sun touch your skin. In many, many cultures and many nations of the world, that was the rule. Right or wrong, that was the rule. The population of the world also has doubled just since 1957, and there are more people out in the sun and on beaches than ever in the history of the world. More light-skinned people have moved south or north, as the case may be, in order to enjoy milder winters. If a person living in the northern hemisphere moves south only 60 to 120 miles, it translates into an increase of 10 to 20% in ultraviolet radiation exposure. Didn't know that, did you? If you were to move from Tromsø, Norway to Panama or Bombay, you're talking about an increase in ultraviolet radiation of more than 600%. According to the theory of those who want to scare you into the New World Order, for that is the only answer to this were it real, a 1% ozone depletion means a 2% increase in ultraviolet radiation. But the data shows ultraviolet radiation actually decreased as much as 7% between 1974 and 1975. when these measurements were taken in the United States. When this study was released in Science magazine by Joseph Scotto of the National Cancer Institute, the only network in the world systematically measuring ultraviolet radiation, the government shut down the instruments. Let me read that again to you so you'll remember it. According to the theory of those who want to scare you into the New World Order, a 1% ozone depletion means a 2% increase in ultraviolet radiation. But the data shows ultraviolet radiation actually decreased as much as 7% between 1974 and 1975, when these measurements were taken in the United States. When this study was released in Science magazine by Joseph Scotto of the National Cancer Institute, the only network in the world systematically measuring ultraviolet radiation, the government shut down the instruments. CFCs, folks, are being banned, yet nobody talks about the consequences of this action. Nobody. Have you ever thought what's going to happen when all the CFCs are banned? The fact is that the entire world food supply depends on what is called the cold chain, the network of refrigerated warehouses and refrigerators in homes, supermarkets, and so on that keep food from spoiling. The world already produces more than enough food to feed every man, woman, and child. The problem is that between 30 to 60% of it spoils every year, depending on the country. By truly banning the CFCs, effectively, you're going to have to scrap every refrigerator around the world. 1 billion home refrigerators, several 100 million commercial refrigerators or more, and it could mean a collapse of the worldwide cold chain and starvation for millions, maybe billions of people. But remember Global 2000? That's exactly what they want to happen. Remember, to make it worse, any potential drop-in substitute cannot presently be used in any existing equipment. So you've got to build entirely new equipment. And who benefits? Who benefits? Have you ever bothered to ask that question? We all lose. And who benefits? The multinational, globalist corporations that belong to the members of the organization that are bringing about the New World Order. The Illuminati. Those who manufacture new equipment and the chemical companies that could make hundreds of billions of dollars in revenues every year from the ban of CFCs. Hundreds of billions of dollars every year, folks. Where's that money going to come from? It's going to come right out of your pockets. Because all frozen food will have its price raised in order to pay for the new refrigeration equipment to keep it frozen and cool. And you're going to have to buy new freezers and new refrigerators and new air conditioners. And your cars are going to have to be retrofitted for new air conditioners, if you want an air conditioner. And it's all going to come out of your pocket because you've fallen for one of the biggest hoaxes ever. Because you were too stupid to check on the data and see for yourself, you're going to pay through the nose. The ozone depletion theory is a fraud. There is no significant increase or decrease in ozone, no significant increase or decrease in ultraviolet radiation. The threat does not exist. It is not there. It has been proven time after time after time. There's one other thing that you need to know. The patents on chlorofluorocarbons, CFCs, are expiring. That means that anybody can now produce CFCs or chlorofluorocarbons, and much cheaper, so that the cost of having air conditioners in your car, in your home, having freezers and refrigerators in supermarkets, meat distribution plants, and in your home would be much cheaper. But it also means that the multinational globalist corporations who have held these patents will lose money. So they're developing replacements for chlorofluorocarbons that not only will cost more, but will make all of the old air conditioners, refrigerators, and freezers obsolete, and will create an entirely new business, and they will make hundreds and hundreds of billions of dollars every year. So you see, folks, we had all better wake up. You know, irregardless of what you hear me say on this show, I care about each and every one of you deeply, or I would not be doing this. All of you who have sent in to join the Citizens Agency for Joint Intelligence, I want to tell you that we have your letters. We are processing them. We will be getting the information and the materials out to you very shortly. And you're going to be excited to hear that we're going to issue press credentials to all CAGI members so that you can get into some places where you normally wouldn't be able to get into, and there'll be legitimate press credentials. For you're going to be operating as an arm of the Hour of the Time and several other media sources who work with us. So remember that, and we're not giving you these credentials so that you can misuse them. They remain the property of the Citizens Agency for Joint Intelligence, and the first time that you misuse those credentials, we'll yank them from you. And you will have to return them because we'll pursue it, believe me. We're issuing these credentials based upon the fact that people who join CAGI care about this country, are normally responsible individuals, and are not going to abuse these press credentials, but will use them to help us to gain more knowledge and information about what's going on around the world, and we'll be able to report to our members the truth as much as we possibly can, rather than what you get out of the controlled media. And if you don't believe the media is controlled by now, folks, you're lost. I can't help you anymore. Now, let me tell you a little bit about my book, Behold a Pale Horse. It is 500 pages of the most suppressed information ever published in the history of the world, documented. And I've been told this by experts. And you need this book. If you don't have this book, you're going to be crippled without it in the future years. This book outlines everything. It tells you everything that you need to know about the New World Order. What's coming in the future, why it's coming, and who's bringing it about. I'm working on my second book now that goes into more detail on the mystery schools, the secret societies, and the people who are bringing this about, the Kennedy assassination, the ultimate solution, everything. You will be amazed. Good night, folks.